The air inside the recital hall felt different, heavier somehow. It wasn't just the cool, controlled temperature that protected the old wood of the floors and the gleam of the grand piano. It was the air itself, thick with almost a century of music. You could almost breathe it in, the ghost of 1,000 violin notes. The echo of perfect chords, the lingering applause for legends long gone. The hall was a sanctuary, a place built not just for sound, but for the soul of sound itself. Every surface, from the dark honey-colored panels that lined the walls to the plush velvet of the empty seats, seemed to soak up the silence and hold it, waiting for the next note to give it meaning. On this particular afternoon, the silence was especially charged. It was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, of the soft rustle of a program turned in a nervous hand, of the creak of a floorboard as someone shifted their weight. Today was not a standard concert. Today was a masterclass, and not just any masterclass. It was one of those rare events that musicians talked about for years, a meeting of titans, seated in 2 ornate chairs, just to the side of the massive concert grand piano were the 2 reasons. The hall was filled to capacity, with some of the most promising young talents in the world. The first was a man who seemed to be carved from the same ancient wood as the hall itself. Maestro Viktor Petrov, at 80 years old, was a living monument to classical music. His back was slightly stooped with age, but when he sat, he did so with a rigid, unbending authority. His suit was impeccably tailored, a dark, severe fabric that seemed to absorb the light. His face was a roadmap of his 80 years, each line and wrinkle telling a story of discipline, of passion, of a lifelong pursuit of an impossible perfection. But it was his hands that truly told the tale. They were spotted with age, the knuckles swollen, yet they rested on his knees with a latent power, like the paws of a sleeping lion. For decades, his name had been synonymous with the piano. He was a guardian of the tradition, a man who believed that the great composers had written a perfect set of instructions, and a musician's job was not to interpret, but to execute with flawless precision. He watched the young students filing in with a critical, almost disappointed gaze, as if already sensing their inadequacies. To him, music was a sacred language with strict grammar, and he had little patience for slang. A few feet away, a complete contrast in form and philosophy, sat Lena Dubois. Where Victor was rigid, she was fluid. She was a modern legend, a queen of jazz, who had won more awards than most musicians could dream of. But she carried her fame with an effortless grace. She was dressed in a simple, elegant pantsuit, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She didn't sit so much as she lounged, one leg crossed over the other, her hands resting in her lap, fingers often gently tapping out a silent, complex rhythm only she could hear. Lena believed that music was a conversation, a living, breathing thing that was meant to be bent, broken, and rebuilt in the moment. To her, the notes on a page were just a suggestion, a starting point for a journey into emotion. She saw the same nervous students Victor saw, but her eyes held not disappointment, but a gentle curiosity. She was wondering what stories they had to tell, what hidden feelings they might let slip through their fingers. The 2 of them together were a fascinating study in opposites, the old master and the modern virtuoso, the architect and the improviser. They respected each other, of course. Their talent was undeniable, but their respect was laced with a constant low-level friction, professional rivalry that played out in magazines and interviews, and in the hushed conversations of music students everywhere. They were here to pass on their knowledge, but everyone knew they were also here to defend their own way of hearing the world. The audience was a sea of young, anxious faces. Students from the festival, their hearts pounding with a mixture of awe and terror. They all dreamed of a moment like this, a chance to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged by one of these giants. But now that the moment was here, the reality of it was crushing. To play for one of them would be the opportunity of a lifetime. To play for both at the same time felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm, with 2 very different judges on either side, each wanting you to fall for a different reason. And in the very back of the hall, tucked into a shadowed corner where the velvet seats were worn and the view of the stage was partially obscured by a pillar, sat a little girl. She was about 7 years old, with a cloud of dark curls and eyes that seemed to take up half her face. She was Clara, the daughter of one of the festival's stagehands. Her father was somewhere backstage, making sure the microphones were working and the piano was perfectly tuned. Clara had finished her homework and, as she often did, had quietly slipped into the back of the hall to wait. To the students and faculty, she was just part of the background, a silent, unmoving fixture in a room full of nervous energy. No one paid her any mind, but Clara was more present than anyone. She wasn't thinking about technique or tradition or impressing anyone. She was just listening. She didn't see a stuffy old man or a cool modern lady. She saw two people who were connected to the big black box on the stage the same way she was. To her, the piano wasn't an instrument of judgment or a tool for fame. It was a magic box. It was a friend. She had been coming to these halls and theaters with her father for as long as she could remember. She had heard geniuses play, and she had heard students stumble. She had heard rehearsals, and she had heard the final perfect notes of a concert. She had never been taught a thing about music. She couldn't read a note. She had never had a lesson. But she had been absorbing it all, letting the sounds wash over her, sink into her, and become a part of her. She watched the way the musicians' bodies moved, the way their faces changed when the music was happy or sad. She wasn't just hearing the music. She was feeling it, like sunlight on her skin or a cool breeze. And as she sat there, unnoticed in the shadows, her small hands resting in her lap, she was just waiting, listening to the silence, waiting for the story to begin. The silence in the hall was finally broken by the sound of a young man clearing his throat. He was the first student brave enough, or perhaps unfortunate enough, to be chosen. His name was Alexei, a lanky 19-year-old, with hair that fell into his eyes and a nervous energy that seemed to crackle around him. He had been a prodigy in his own small town, the one everyone said was destined for greatness. But here, in this room, under the gaze of the two giants, he felt like a fraud. Every step he took toward the piano felt like walking through water, the air thick with expectation. He sat on the bench, its worn velvet cool beneath him, and placed his trembling fingers on the ivory keys. For a moment he just sat there, his eyes closed, trying to remember the person he used to be, the boy who just loved to play. He began with a Chopin etude, a piece known for its beauty and its technical difficulty. The first few bars were clean, precise, and full of a youthful passion that was almost desperate. He was trying so hard to be perfect, to show them everything he had learned, every hour of practice, every sacrifice. You could hear it in the music. It was technically impressive, but it was tight, like a beautiful painting locked in a glass case. It was missing the breath of life. He was executing the notes, just as the maestro believed they should be executed. But he was thinking so hard about each one that the music felt like a math problem instead of an emotion. Then he reached the passage. It was a cascade of rapid, intricate notes that required a lightness of touch, a feeling of effortlessness. He knew it was coming, and the fear of it was enough to make it happen. His fingers, which had been flying with such confidence, suddenly felt like clumsy sausages. A note was missed, then another, and the flowing river of music became a stumbling, messy trickle. The sound was jarring in the quiet hall, a tiny but catastrophic failure. He stopped, his hands frozen on the keys, his face flushing a deep, painful red. The silence that followed was worse than any criticism. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of embarrassment. From his chair, Maestro Petrov let the silence hang for a long moment, letting the students' discomfort steep. Then he moved with a speed that belied his age. He rose from his chair, his footsteps sharp and loud on the wooden stage, and approached the piano. He didn't say a word. He just raised his right hand, his knuckles thick and gnarled, and rapped them sharply on the wood of the piano. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet hall. "No, no," he boomed, his voice not just loud but filled with a profound, almost paternal disappointment. It was the voice of a man who had given his life to this art and who was pained to see it mishandled. "You are a typist, not a musician. You are typing out a code, you are not telling a story." He leaned over the student, his shadow falling over him. You are thinking, I can hear the gears in your head turning from all the way over here. The piano does not care for your thoughts. It is a heart, not a brain. It only cares for your soul. You must feel the music, not just execute the notes. You must bleed onto the keys, not just press them with your fingers. Alexei flinched with every word, shrinking smaller on the bench. The other students in the audience watched, a mixture of sympathy and relief washing over them. It wasn't them. Not this time. The maestro straightened up, his chest puffing out. He was not just teaching Alexei. He was performing for the entire room. This was his philosophy, laid bare in its harshest form. To prove his point, he turned away from the trembling student and faced the audience, a glint of something challenging, almost mischievous, in his pale eyes. Perhaps someone here can show us, he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Someone without the burden of all this training. Someone who is not afraid of making a mistake. Someone who can simply find middle C and tell us a story with it. Just one note. Who can do that? The offer was clearly rhetorical, theatrical gesture designed to humiliate the struggling student and to emphasize his point about the purity of untrained feeling. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew it was a trap. To volunteer would be to walk into a lion's den. Who would dare to play for him after that? Who would be foolish enough to think they could impress him with a single note? The maestro scanned the faces in the front rows, enjoying their discomfort. But then a different voice cut through the tension. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it had a clarity that made everyone turn. What about the little one? It was Lena Dubois. She hadn't moved from her chair, but she had been watching the whole scene with a calm, unreadable expression. While the maestro was a storm, she was the deep, quiet ocean. Her eyes, which had been half closed in thought, were now open and fixed on the very back of the hall. A playful, gentle smile was on her lips, as if she had just thought of a wonderful secret. All heads, including the maestro's, followed her gaze. There, in the shadows, tucked into her corner seat, was Clara. She had been watching the whole scene unfold, her wide eyes taking in everything: the student's shame, the maestro's anger, the beautiful broken music. She had felt it all. Now to have 100 pairs of eyes suddenly turn on her was like being caught in a spotlight. She sank down into her seat, wishing she could melt into the worn velvet and disappear. The shadows had been her friends, but now they were shrinking away, leaving her exposed. Maestro Petrov peered into the back of the hall, his eyes struggling to focus in the dim light. When he finally saw the small figure, a look of utter disbelief crossed his face, which quickly melted into amusement. He let out a short, harsh laugh. The child. You cannot be serious, Lena. He found the idea absurd. A perfect punchline to his dramatic lesson. What better way to show that true music required immense skill than to have a small child fail at the simplest task? But Lena just smiled, her eyes still on Clara. I am serious, she said, her voice calm and steady. She has been listening more intently than anyone here. She hasn't been thinking about technique or impressing you. She has just been... Let's see what she has to say. The maestro considered this, a slow, cunning smile spreading across his face. He saw it now. It was even better than he thought. It was the perfect way to end his demonstration. He would let the child come up. She would fumble, and the point would be made once and for all. He turned his commanding gaze back to the corner. Come, child, he said, his voice a booming royal command. Do not be shy. Come forward. Let us all see what you have. He waved a dismissive hand toward the stage as if beckoning a pet. Let us hear your story. Let's go expand Caro without heading 1,600 words, in simple English words. Part 3, it should be interesting. And every part should be engaging so the audience doesn't get bored. Also keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI generated. Also, don't create violated content which can affect YouTube policy. Also, don't use names like Marcus, Sarah, Emma, Jamal, etc. The command hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Come, child. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a king on his throne. For a moment, Clara didn't move. She was a small statue frozen in the shadows, her heart beating a frantic drum-like rhythm against her ribs. Every eye in the hall was on her, 100 bright burning lights that made her want to shrink into nothingness. The journey from her safe corner to the stage suddenly seemed as long and dangerous as a crossing of a vast ocean. She could feel the weight of the maestro's expectation, which was really just a mask for his desire to see her fail. She could also feel a different kind of energy coming from the woman, Lena, a soft, encouraging warmth that was like a single candle in a dark room. Finally, she moved. Her small shoes made no sound on the thick carpet of the aisle. She walked with the slow, hesitant steps of a fawn, her head down, eyes fixed on the floor as if she were following a path only she could see. As she passed the rows of students, she could feel their stares. Some were filled with pity, others with a morbid curiosity. They were all thinking the same thing. This poor kid is about to be publicly humiliated. The stage seemed to grow bigger with every step she took, and the piano at its center looked less like an instrument and more like a giant. Sleeping beast, when she finally stepped onto the polished wood of the stage, the world changed. The air was different here. It was clearer, sharper. She was no longer part of the audience. She was part of the performance. She walked to the center of the stage and stopped before the concert grand piano. It was enormous. Its black, gleaming surface reflected the stage lights like a pool of dark water. The white keys stretched out before her like a long, endless road. It was so much bigger up close than it had ever seemed from the back of the hall. She had to stand on her tiptoes just to see over the top. She climbed onto the velvet bench, the effort making her little grunt softly. Once she was seated, her feet dangled high above the pedals, swinging gently like pendulums. She was so small that the piano seemed to swallow her whole, her tiny frame lost in its immense shadow. She looked like a doll that had been placed there as a joke. From his chair, Maestro Petrov watched this spectacle with a deep, growing satisfaction. This was perfect. The visual alone was a lesson. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, a smug smile playing on his lips. He was already composing the scathing remark he would deliver once the child produced her inevitable clumsy noise. He would use it as the final, definitive nail in the coffin of his argument that music was not a game, not a feeling, but a discipline forged over a lifetime of grueling work. But Lena Dubois was leaning so far forward in her chair, she was almost on her feet. Her playful demeanor was gone, replaced by an intensity that was almost startling. Her eyes were narrowed, fixed not on the girl's face, but on her small hands as they hovered over the keys. There was something in the stillness of the child that she recognized, something that went beyond shyness or fear. It was a kind of focus, a deep, quiet concentration that she had only ever seen in the greatest of musicians. It was the look of someone who was not thinking about what they were going to do, but was simply listening for what the music wanted them to do. Clara placed her hands on the keys. Her posture was all wrong. Her back was slumped, her wrists were bent at an odd angle, and her fingers were curved in a way that would have made any piano teacher gasp in horror. It was a complete mess, a picture of everything the maestro stood against. He opened his mouth, the cruel words already forming on his tongue, ready to slice through the silence. "Wait," Lena whispered. Her voice so soft it was almost a breath, but it cut through the tension like a knife. The maestro paused, turning to look at her, annoyed by the interruption. But when he saw her face, he stopped. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of awe and urgency. She wasn't looking at him. She was still completely mesmerized by the girl. Clara didn't seem to hear any of this. She wasn't aware of the two legends or the silent audience. In her world, it was just her and the magic box. She didn't look for middle C, as the maestro had sarcastically suggested. She didn't search for any note at all. Her fingers, which looked so small and delicate on the vast expanse of white and black, had just hovered for a moment, trembling slightly. It was as if she were reading a story written in the air just above the keys, a story that only she could see. Her head was cocked to the side, her brow furrowed in concentration, as if she were listening to a distant melody that no one else could hear. Then, she began to play. The first sound that filled the hall was not a single note. It was a chord, a complex, layered sound that seemed to bloom in the air like a dark, beautiful flower. It was not the happy, simple sound of a child's tune. It was a melancholic sound, filled with a deep, aching sadness. But woven into that sadness was something else, a strange kind of hope. The chord had a dissonance to it, a note that didn't seem to belong. It created a tension in the air, a feeling of being unresolved. It was the kind of sound that a seasoned composer might craft after years of study. A sound that was technically wrong, but emotionally devastatingly right. It was a question asked in a language that no one in that room had ever heard. A 7-year-old speak. The effect was instantaneous and electric. A collective, silent gasp rippled through the audience. The students who had been expecting a joke were now leaning forward, their faces masks of confusion and disbelief. The sound was so sophisticated, so full of a mature, complex emotion, that it was impossible to process. On stage, Lena Dubois slowly closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She had been right. She knew it in her bones. This was not a child playing. This was something else entirely. And Maestro Petrov. The maestro was frozen. The sarcastic smile had vanished from his face, replaced by a look of utter shock. His arms, which had been crossed so confidently over his chest, had fallen to his sides. His mouth, which had been open to deliver a cutting remark, was now hanging slightly agape. He was a man who had heard everything, who had categorized and understood every nuance of sound for 80 years. But what he was hearing now, it didn't fit into any category he knew. It was a sound that was both ancient and brand new, a sound that seemed to bypass his brain and speak directly to his soul. He stared at the small girl, his mind a complete blank. For the first time in his life, utterly and completely speechless. The first chord didn't just fade away. It seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving behind a ghost of a question. And then, from the stillness, another sound emerged. A single, clear note played by her right hand, a simple melody that sounded lonely, like a voice calling out in an empty room. Before the echo of that note had even died, her left hand answered with a different melody, a lower, more thoughtful voice. It was like watching two strangers meet and begin a conversation. The two melodies danced around each other, sometimes close, sometimes far apart, but always connected by an invisible thread of logic. This was the architecture the maestro understood, the mathematical purity of a fugue. It was complex, intricate, and built with a precision that should have been impossible for a mind, let alone a pair of hands that had never been trained. But this was no dry academic exercise. Woven into the perfect structure was a raw, aching humanity. The lonely melody in her right hand would sometimes bend a note, just slightly, making it sound like a sob. The thoughtful voice in her left hand would sometimes slide into a rhythm that wasn't strict or classical. It had a gentle, swaying feel, like a person rocking themselves to sleep after a long day of sorrow. It was the language of the blues, a language of pain and survival, a language that Lena Dubois had spent her entire life speaking. She was listening to a conversation between Bach and a forgotten blues musician from the Mississippi Delta. A conversation that was happening in the hands of a 7-year-old girl who had no business knowing either of them. The music began to grow. The two conversing melodies were joined by a third, then a fourth. All of them weaving together into a tapestry of sound so rich and dense, it felt like you could reach out and touch it. The tempo began to quicken, the lonely call becoming more urgent, the thoughtful answer becoming more agitated. The music was telling a story now. It was a story of a storm gathering. You could hear the first drops of rain in the high, tinkling notes she played with her right hand, and you could hear the low rumble of thunder in the deep resonant chords. Her left hand began to pound out. Her small body started to move with the music, swaying back and forth, her head nodding to a rhythm only she could feel. She was no longer just sitting on the bench. She was a part of the piano, a conduit for the story it was desperate to tell. Then the storm broke. All the intricate woven melodies seemed to collapse into a single, powerful current of sound. It was a torrent of emotion, a flood of notes that was both chaotic and perfectly controlled. This was no longer a conversation. It was a cry. A raw, primal scream of joy and pain, of loss and love, all happening at once. Her fingers were no longer just pressing keys, they were flying across them, a blur of motion that seemed physically impossible for a child her size. The sound was enormous, filling every corner of the vast hall, shaking the very floorboards. It was the sound of a heart breaking and a soul being born in the same instant. In the audience, the students were no longer students. They were just people, completely and utterly undone. The young man who had failed so miserably just minutes before was weeping openly. It's not from shame, but from a profound, overwhelming sense of wonder. He was hearing the music he had always wanted to make, the music that lived in his deepest dreams but was always trapped by his fear and his training. All around the hall, people were frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and tears. They were witnessing something that went beyond talent, beyond skill. They were witnessing a miracle. On stage, Lena Dubois had both hands covering her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had built her career on improvisation, on the idea that she could channel pure emotion through her instrument. But this was something else entirely. This was not improvisation. It was revelation. This was a music that didn't need to be learned because it had always existed. And this little girl was simply the first person pure enough to let it through. She felt a sense of humility so deep it was almost painful. All her awards, all her accolades, all her fame suddenly felt like childish toys. She was in the presence of a true master. The master was a child who didn't even know what a master was. And Maestro Petrov, the great maestro, was broken. The rigid, unbending pillar of classical music had crumbled into dust. His perfect posture had slumped. His head was bowed and his hands, which had always been so steady and commanding, were trembling in his lap. Everything he had ever believed about music was being torn down and rebuilt in front of him. He had always believed that genius was a fire that had to be carefully tended, fed with discipline and shaped by years of grueling practice. But what he was hearing was a wildfire, a force of nature that couldn't be contained or taught. It had the structure he revered, but it was filled with a soul he had always dismissed as undisciplined. It was perfect, and it was messy. It was a masterpiece, and it was a beautiful disaster. He was an old man who had thought he had seen everything, and he was realizing that he had seen nothing. For the first time in his long, storied life, he was not a teacher. He was not a judge. He was just a man, listening to a sound that was changing him forever. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The torrent of notes subsided, the thunderous chords softened, and the music began to quiet down. The complex tapestry unraveled, leaving just a single, simple melody again. But this time, it didn't sound lonely. It sounded peaceful, like the calm after the storm, like the first rays of sun breaking through the clouds. She played a few more soft, gentle chords, each one like a sigh of relief. And then, with the touch of a feather, she played one last note. A single soft sound that hung in the air like a perfect, unanswered question. And then there was silence. A silence so complete, so profound, that it was louder than the music had been. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of what they had just heard. No one moved. No one breathed. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for an answer to the question the little girl had asked with her final note. The single, soft note Clara played seemed to hang in the air like a tiny silver star. It didn't fade away so much as it was absorbed into the deep silence of the hall, leaving behind an echo that was not of sound, but of feeling. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. No one dared to breathe. It was as if the entire world had been reset by the music, and everyone was waiting to see what the new rules were. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled to the brim with the ghost of the story they had just heard. It was a sacred silence, a fragile thing that everyone was afraid to break. Then, the smallest of movements broke the spell. Clara, her task complete, calmly slid off the velvet bench. Her small shoes made a soft thud on the wooden floor of the stage. She didn't turn to the audience. She didn't look for her mother. She didn't bow or smile or seek any kind of approval. She simply patted the side of the big black piano, the way a child might pat a friendly dog after a good game. and then she turned and began to walk back the way she came. Her walk was the same as before, slow, unhurried, her feet making almost no sound. She was just a little girl who had finished something and was now moving on to the next thing. That simple. Ordinary action was the catalyst. The silence shattered. It didn't start as applause. It started as a single, sharp intake of breath from someone in the front row, followed by a choked sob. Then another. And then, like a dam breaking, the sound came. It wasn't a polite rhythmic clapping. It was an explosion. A chaotic, emotional, deafening roar that seemed to come from the very soul of everyone in the room. People were on their feet, their bodies moving on their own, driven by a force they couldn't understand. They were shouting not words, but sounds of pure, unadulterated awe. "Brava!" Someone screamed, their voice cracking with emotion. "Encore!" cried another, though they knew it was impossible. Hands clapped until they were red and raw. Tears streamed down faces, the faces of stern professors, of jaded critics, of ambitious students. In that moment, they were none of those things. They were just human beings who had been touched by something divine, something that had reached past their minds and their training and had spoken directly to their hearts. The young man who had stumbled through the Chopin etude was clapping the hardest, his face wet with tears, a look of pure, unfiltered joy on his face. He had been given a gift, a glimpse into a world he never knew existed, and it had washed away all his fear and insecurity. But the object of this adoration was already gone. While the hall erupted into a frenzy of emotion, Clara had reached the back row. She simply took her mother's hand, who looked down at her with an expression of loving, gentle confusion. She didn't ask what had happened. She just squeezed her daughter's hand. Together they slipped out a side door and into the quiet of the corridor, leaving the storm of applause behind them. The applause would continue for minutes, a desperate attempt to hold on to the magic. But the magician had already left the building on stage. The two legends remained, like statues left behind after a flood. Maestro Petrov slowly, carefully removed his glasses from his face. He took a clean white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the lenses, though they were not smudged. It was a mechanical action, something to do with his hands, because his mind had completely stopped working. His hands were trembling, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor that he had not experienced since he was a young boy. He put his glasses back on, but the world looked different now. The polished wood of the stage, the velvet seats, the faces of the people in the crowd, they all seemed less real. Less important than the sound that was still echoing in his head. He turned his head slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural, and looked at Lena Dubois. His face, which had been a mask of stern authority for so many years, was now completely open. It was a face of a man who had lost his way and was asking for directions. "What was that?" he asked. His voice was not a boom. It was barely a whisper, a raw, fragile sound that was filled with a wonder so deep it was almost painful. "What? What was that?" Lena Dubois was still crying, but the tears were no longer just of sadness or joy. They were tears of understanding, of recognition. She looked at the old maestro, her rival, her colleague, her fellow traveler on the long road of music, and she saw not a rival, but a brother. They were two people who had just been shown the face of God, and they were equally humbled. She shook her head slowly, a sad, beautiful smile on her lips. "That, Victor," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the fading applause. "That was the reason we all started playing in the first place. Before we learned the notes, before we learned the rules, before we learned to be afraid, that was the music." The mystery of Clara was never solved. No one could find her or her father after the master class. They had simply packed up and left, as if it had been just another day at work. The story of the performance spread through the festival like wildfire and into the wider music world, becoming a kind of modern myth. Some said it was an exaggeration, a tall tale told by overwhelmed students. Others who were there insisted it was the single most profound musical experience of their lives. But for the two people on that stage, it was not a myth. It was a reality that changed them. Maestro Petrov, in the remaining years of his life, became a different kind of teacher. He was still demanding, still a perfectionist. but there was a new gentleness in him, a new understanding that the most important things in music could not be taught. And Lena Dubois, when she played, often found her mind drifting back to that afternoon, to the sound of a storm and the quiet that followed, a reminder that the greatest music was not the music you created, but the music you allowed to flow through you. It was just a moment in time, a brief, impossible miracle that occurred in a quiet hall on a sunny afternoon. It was a reminder that sometimes the most incredible gifts in the world are not born from discipline or genius, but from a pure and open heart. And for those who were there, they would spend the rest of their lives listening, hoping to hear it just one more time, though they knew they never would.